Hey everybody, Big Jason. Today I'm interviewing Caleb O'Dowd, a fellow Halbert protege. What's up, Caleb?
Hey, Jason, how you doing, man?
Good. So, guys, as you may or may not know, Caleb and I's good friend Scott Mongo Haines, who recently passed away over Christmas, and you know, I hung out with Caleb. Scott in person for the last 4 years, and I know Caleb that you had a long history with Scott, both in person and offline. So before we break down this ad, it's I believe a $5,000 e class, and it was 2007, so basically over 10 years ago. And I talked to Scott's longest running client, and he said he's still using a version of this today. He can't beat it. He's using it online. But before we go over that, I just want to talk to you about your personal relationship with Scott, how you became to know him, maybe a little bit about Gary. And so why don't you tell us?
Yeah, obviously, I learned of Scott through Gary. I lived and worked with Gary for a little over 3 years, and during that time, Scott and Gary were very close. Gary pretty much would refer to Scott as one of his sons. Gary also, pretty much told me on more than one occasion that Scott, Gary was an if-then type of guy. He was always, coming up with crazy scenarios in his head and if this, then that. And Gary used to always say to me, not always, but I mean on several occasions, he would talk about how if his life depended on it, he would have Scott write the ad. If his life depended on creating a winning sales letter, he would ask Scott to do that.
Wow.
And I always remember I actually never met Scott for, I don't know, I think it was maybe I think it was after my 3 years with Gary that I actually met Scott. So all during this time, I never really knew Scott. I just know that I knew that Gary spoke very, very highly of him. And Gary gave me his course, and I went through his course and I saw all of his letters and everything. His course is absolutely incredible, and it's incredible in ways that I'll cover in a few minutes, because I do think that it's incredible in ways that I think people should know about. And Scott was incredible in ways that I think people should know about as well. But yeah, so for like 3 years, I would regularly hear Scott Haines this, Scott that, Scott the other. And I know that he was kind of the original road dog,
Right.
There was, John Carlton kind of came to Gary, and John wasn't really a road dog, so to speak. They were kind of, there wasn't that big of a difference between
Right.
their ages. They were more kind of buddies. John was also very well accomplished. So, John wasn't really, at least in my own opinion, a road dog, so to speak. They were road dogs, but not in the sense that, Sam, Scott, and I were road
Sure.
dogs, which meant that we were just told
Yeah.
when to do it. And it was very much a kind of Gary was the alpha dog and everyone else just kind of did what they were told.
Right.
So Scott was kind of the original road dog of that kind of nature. So I always knew that Scott kind of held that place in Gary's heart. The two of them had been through a lot. They'd seen a lot. They'd done a lot. They'd covered a lot of ground. And so that's kind of, my first introduction to Scott was just listening to Gary talk about him a lot. And tell me these great things, and then he shared his course with me. Later on, he shared his course with me, and I went through his course, and I got an awful lot. I got an awful lot from Scott's course, and then I met Scott. I moved down to Costa Rica after my time with Gary. Gary took me down to Costa Rica, and I loved it there. And I ended up moving there and living there, and then Sam Markowitz came in behind me with Gary. Sam hooked up with Gary, and then I started hearing, from Gary, this guy Sam is really awesome and everything. And then I heard, hey, Scott's coming down to visit, and then Gary decided, hey, you know what? I want you to meet Sam. I want you to meet Scott. We're all going to come down to Costa Rica and hang out. So that's actually how I met Scott. Scott came down with Gary, and that's how I met Sam. And yeah, I met Scott down in Costa Rica. We had a great time, and we had a crazy time.
I heard.
Maybe stories for another time.
Yes.
But we had a great time in Costa Rica, and I immediately knew, Gary was my type of guy, and Gary's guys were my type of guys, and vice versa, I think. And Scott was just a really, really awesome, great dude. So was Sam. And that's how I got to know Scott. I kind of had this impression in my head that actually I don't even know what my impression was, but Scott just kind of burst the bubble. He was just such a cool, humble, chilled out guy. Never really, his tonality never, increased or decreased. He was always just kind of a relaxed, chilled out, flip flop wearing, short and t-shirt type of dude, but behind his disarming persona was, I just this massive wealth of knowledge in terms of salesmanship and advertising, and he was very much a kind of a historian of advertising. Like anytime I spoke to Scott, he was always telling me about, he would always just recount a story from either an existing, rock star advertiser, or else like an advertiser, from days gone by, and he was just a huge kind of library of information. I was always impressed at how much he actually knew about stuff. And I in thinking about this interview and thinking about how to describe Scott, Scott was a true salesman in print. And I think, a massive misconception in terms of advertising comes from the word copywriter. Copywriter implies that your job is to write and put words on a page, and it's the furthest from the truth. It's absolutely the furthest from the truth. And I think one of the great insults that you could give someone is that you're a good copywriter, because I think that it completely misses the mark entirely. I know great copywriters that can't generate any sales. They're magnificent at putting words on a page, but they don't know their ass from their elbow when it comes time to actually generate sales. Scott was the total opposite. If you look at any of Scott's stuff, it's absolutely not impressive from the perspective of it being like a wonderful piece of writing. There were copywriters out there who can write with great prose, but Scott was not one of them. But Scott was a ruthlessly effective salesman in print, and there is a huge, huge difference. I see a lot of copywriters these days, and they're capable of putting a tremendous amount of words on a page, but actually there's no salesmanship going on there of any great measure whatsoever. And Scott was the total opposite. Scott really, and the ad that we're going to look at here in a little bit, is just loaded with psychology from head to toe. It's loaded with salesmanship. And another thing that Scott was really, really good at was understanding salesmanship and understanding the sales triggers, tactics, and strategies. And that kind of comes back to Scott's course, which is Scott's course it really does own its own place, in the kind of, the education that I think copywriters need to go through in order to become, a proper salesman in print. Scott's course goes through, an awful lot of tactics, strategies, and techniques and sales triggers. And I think an awful lot of that is lost these days in, kind of the structure of how things should look and the kind of the way things should flow and all that kind of stuff. I think at the end of the day, what we really are is salesmen in print. And Scott truly understood that. Scott was also the type of person, I remember Gary telling me this, when I first went to Gary, Gary had been hired by a real estate guru. I can't think of his name right now. Ron LeGrand, actually. Yeah. From Ron LeGrand. And Ron LeGrand went out because, he had such a massive list and he had such a massive mailing universe. Ron LeGrand would hire like 5 or 6 different copywriters. He'd spend an arm and a leg, and he would hire 5 or 6 different copywriters to all create a piece of advertising for his program, and he would test them all together. And I won't mention some of the very big names out there that were part of this test. They were just names on a page for me at the time, but I later, grew to understand who those people were. But Gary had just gotten the results by fax. And, Ron brutally laid out everyone's results. And Gary had won by a wide margin. It wasn't like, he won like by a small margin. He had beat the number 2 guy by a very, very wide margin. And I remember I had just started working with him. This had just happened like maybe 2 or 3 days after I started working with him.
Uh-huh.
And Gary's message to me was, do you know why I won by a wide margin? And obviously I did not. And his answer was, because I knew what to tell those people in order to get them to buy. I knew what to say. And his message to me was, if you know what to say to people to get them to buy, there's no more valuable skill that you can acquire as a salesman in print. And Scott had that. And I didn't understand that at the time, because I think a lot of people kind of research, like a copy project. They go out and they research the market and the prospect, and then they research the problem, and then they research the solution, and yada, yada, yada. And that's an entirely different approach than sitting down to find out what exactly I must say in order to get the sale. It's an entirely different, strategic approach to being successful. And Scott had that. Scott had that skill, and Gary knew that he had it. And as a result, Gary placed him very, 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 very high on the totem pole of who's who in the copywriting world. The sad thing is that Scott was so freaking humble that he never kind of put himself out there to be the person that he truly was, which was a superstar, rock star copywriter. He was always kind of humble, behind the scenes type of guy, and therefore I think that he's never really gained the reputation that he so truly deserves. And I think that through your assistance there, Jason, hopefully that he will start to gain that all too late in life, obviously. But
for sure,
he really was a rock star. He was someone who, per the cloth that I was cut from, he was absolutely a true salesman in print. And he was, I also get people asking me all the time, hey, Caleb, how can, how do I tell the difference between a good copywriter versus a bad copywriter? And I always say, just ask him or her for their top 5 controls and the numbers associated with it, because that really separates the men from the boys, Like, I have a lot of guys coming to me all the time telling me they're copywriters and that they're motivated to get going, and I say, great, send me over your top 5 controls, and I always get excuses for why they don't have them. Then Scott probably had 5 of his controls sitting under his sitting under a cup of coffee on his table. Right. He was the type of person that had more controls than you could shake a freaking stick at, he was not just a great, salesman in print. He was freaking prolific. He was absolutely prolific in his creation of killer advertising. So Scott was someone that could provide you, probably not with just 5, he could probably provide you with 50 or more of his controls. And he would have, real world examples of like, this made this did that, this did the other. So he's got just such a massive breadth of stuff, of just winning controls. And I mean, anyone can get lucky and produce a winning piece of advertising every now and again. To do it, month after month, year after year, decade after decade is that's someone that truly is, a wizard at advertising. And Scott was actually truly a wizard at advertising. So I don't know if that answers a bit of a long-winded question, a long-winded answer there, Jason. But
no,
that's how I met Scott. Yeah, that's how I met Scott. I met him down in Costa Rica. I met him through Gary. Those are some of the things that Gary said about him. And Scott certainly lived up to all of that and more. I used to connect with Scott, not nearly enough as I should have, but I would connect with Scott every, 3, 4, or 5 months, and we'd spend like 2, 3, 4 hours on the phone, just talking about life and Gary and marketing and advertising and all that kind of good stuff. He was absolutely an awesome guy. That was just a very, always found him to be a very humble, a very kind, generous person who was willing to just share everything he knew with anyone who would ask him about it.
Awesome. So Caleb, I found a lot of correspondence where you would, from time to time, ask Scott if you could see some of his controls or some of his sales letters for a project you were working on. And you and I just looked at the correspondence, which I have permission to share, from a famous Agora copywriter, John Angel, where he basically said that a current 5-year control he's using was modeled after a sales letter by Scott, and that his longest running client told me that he's still using 3 controls from Scott. One was 14 years ago, and one was 10 years ago, one was about 8 years ago. What would you say to someone, either a young copywriter, someone who wants to learn copy or know what good copy looks like, or maybe a copywriter who wants to improve their skills and they have the opportunity again to get Scott's course and get their hands on these new swipes that many of them you don't even have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what I think is different about what Scott does is just kind of some of the things that I mentioned. Number one, Scott is a salesman in print. He's not a copywriter. And I think to the beginning copywriter, that statement will probably fly over their heads without it landing like lightning. And at some point in their career, that statement will land like lightning, because it is everything. Being a salesman in print, you're either a salesman in print or you're fooling yourself thinking you're going to get better as a copywriter. You're not. Gary told me, don't try and be a good writer. Be a good salesman. And Scott was a good salesman. And, the letter we're going to look at here is freaking 7 pages long. And it sells a multi-$1,000 training program. And it's been a control for 10 years. Like, no copywriter could do that. No copywriter. You sit down as a copywriter, and you know what the biggest mistake someone would make? Like, a copywriter would sit down and write a 30-page advertisement. And it would be 30 pages of just dull, boring, totally unstrategic sales copy. Scott was able to achieve in 7 letters what most people wouldn't be able to achieve, no matter how many pages they had. And the reason for that is because Scott understood master level, high level salesmanship, and it's not pretty. You know, like being an effective, efficient salesman is not pretty. And Scott's copy was not pretty, but it always went for the jugular. You know,
Right.
the other thing that was different about Scott, and the reason why he was able to kind of pull this stuff off, is because Scott knew what to say. Most people don't know what to say. You know, Scott knew what to say. And for that reason alone, you should be studying Scott with, you know, you should be putting everything that he, you know, that's in that course under a freaking microscope. You should be studying it because, as Gary told me, there's no more important skill in the game of salesmanship than the skill of knowing what to say to make the sale. And that steps outside formulas and stuff,
Right.
you know, which Scott lived by talk about being formulaic. The first thing that jumped out at me as I read this sales letter that we're going to look at here is just how, like, tightly Scott stuck to formulas. But what we're talking about is outside formulas. It's just knowing what it is to say to get the sale. Because people just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk because they think it's about putting words on a page, and it's not.
Right.
You know, if you think that you have to fill a white page with black ink, you've got a long way to go. It's salesmanship from head to toe, top to bottom, and Scott was a salesman. So, you know, number one, you know, Scott was a salesman. Number two, he always knew what, you know, needed to be said in order to get the sale. Number three, he was just a master of triggers, tactics, and strategies, you know, and we'll look at some of these here, and they're lost to a huge degree. They're lost in modern advertising, you know, because, as I said, that word copywriter has watered down the reality of what it is that people are actually there to do. It's, you know, the word copywriter should be eliminated from vocabulary. It should be just a salesman in print. And because it'll reframe the whole purpose of what people are trying to achieve there. But Scott was a master of triggers, tactics, and strategies. And Gary gave him that. I feel Gary gave me that. Carlton has it as well. Sam has it. But I really, you know, even the other top copywriters, like beyond like the upper echelon, the Gary Bensavengas, Jim Rutz, you know, Clayton Makepeace, the Paris Lampropoulos and stuff like that. I mean, beyond those guys, it's just not out there, you know. It's just not out there. But Scott, you can... here's something else, you know, like when you look at Bensavenga stuff, you look at Makepeace stuff, it's so hidden that it's difficult to kind of see it unless you're really an advanced, you're really advanced in your knowledge and awareness of it. But Scott's stuff is raw and it's naked, and you can see it and you can learn from it. And I'll point out in a little bit when we go through these ads, like what exactly it is that I'm talking about, and you will see it in a new light because, you know, Scott's stuff is easy to learn from. It's right there. It's in your face. It's not hidden behind a curtain. And I think that, you know, for these reasons, you know, Scott's course, as I said, it owns its place in kind of the necessary education that people must go through in order to become, you know, an effective salesman in print. So I think that, I think it's critical. The reason why his stuff is lasting 4 and 5 and 10 years, you know, in an environment where it's difficult to get anything to last for 12 months.
Right.
The reason for that is because of what I just mentioned. You know, he knows what to say. He works to a very tight formula, and his messages, his sales messages, are jam-packed from head to toe with triggers, tactics, and strategies. And as a result, they're bloody hard to beat, you know, and they just stand the test of time. So yeah, it's going to be a lot easier for you to learn salesmanship from Scott because his stuff is so naked and it's so evident and it's so clear to see. But don't be fooled. It's master level copywriting, at its at the peak of what's possible there. So yeah, just I would recommend everyone get in on it because I don't think that there's anybody else out there that's teaching that stuff in that way.
Awesome, man.
Everyone else is trying to just teach you how to be a copywriter, and you got to be careful of that. You're not a copywriter; you're a salesman in print.
That's some good stuff. Thanks, man. All right, so let's break down this ad.
All right.
Hey, this is Big Jason. So if you want to get on the waiting list for Shortcut Copywriting Secrets version 2 and Hottest Sales Letters volume 1 and 2, plus all the ad breakdowns of Scott's best ads, breakdowns by Caleb, Sam Markowitz, Bon Halbert, Clayton Makepeace, Paris Lampropoulos, David Deutsch, David Garfinkel, John Carlton, Brian Kurtz, Kevin Rogers, and many other top copywriters, go to shortcutcopywritingsecrets.com, get on the wait list. Just for getting on the wait list, I'm going to give you a rare recording of a Gary Halbert seminar, and you'll be automatically entered into a referral contest where you can win all kinds of never-before-seen swipes and ad breakdowns just for referring the version 2 of Shortcut Copywriting Secrets. So again, this is Big Jason. Thank you so much for helping me honor Scott's legacy. Get on the wait list at shortcutcopywritingsecrets.com, and I'll see you there. Thanks.